commended self to God. Carey wrote to London explaining his commitment. We must work the works of Him who sent us. Whatsoever our hands find to do must be done with our might. Not to have the heart to improve the price of a God-given opportunity is to deserve the epithet of a fool. That was Carey's commitment. By 1812, a dozen years later, the missionary station at Serampore had grown remarkably. It now included a compound of several buildings, including one very large building over 170 feet long. In addition to housing a vast printing shop, complete with printing presses that printed and bound Bibles, tracts, and other books, it was the workplace for dozens of nationals, dozens of pundits, they were called, from many different Indian language groups, working on new dictionaries and grammar books which had never before been produced. Most importantly, it was the center for the translation, editing, and preparation of the Scriptures for at that time, over a dozen language groups which had never before heard God's Word in their tongue. The mission station even had its own paper mill to produce the right kind of paper for Bibles, and even manufactured its own ink for the presses. On Wednesday, March 11th, 1812, while Carey was in Calcutta for his weekly lectures at the college, a fire ripped through the large building at the mission station in Serampore. Those on site desperately tried to save parts of the building from the fire, but largely to no avail. Thankfully, no lives were lost, but there were no internet clouds in those days. With the exception of a handful of documents, all of the original copies of the translations, dictionaries, and other manuscripts important for translation were destroyed. Much of the equipment was destroyed as well. It was a tremendous intellectual and financial loss. They estimated that it would take years to recover the information, the knowledge that was lost, and to replace the destroyed equipment. How could God allow for the loss of so much of the newly translated Scriptures? Carey learned of the news the following day, on Thursday, March 12th, from teammate Joshua Marshman, who traveled to Calcutta to break the news. Later that same day, just hours after receiving the news, Carey would complete a letter which he had begun writing before he had received the news. He started writing it the previous day. These are his words. I began this last night, this letter. I close it hastily this morning, having received intelligence of a dreadful loss which befell the mission last night. Our printing office was totally destroyed by fire. This is a heavy blow, as it will stop our printing the Scriptures for a long time. 12 months hard labor will not reinstate us, not to mention the loss of property, manuscripts, etc., which we scarcely shall ever surmount. I wish to be still and know that the Lord is God, and to bow to His will in everything. He will no doubt bring good out of this evil and make it promote His interests. But at present, the providence is exceedingly dark. Carey returned the next day to Serampore with Marshman. The team immediately began compiling an inventory of that which could be salvaged from the ashes. With tears in his eyes, Carey stated, "In one night, the labors of years are consumed. How unsearchable our divine ways. I had lately brought some things, some translations, to the utmost perfection I could, and contemplated the mission with perhaps too much self-congratulation. The Lord has laid me low, that I may look more simply to Him. That night, the team gathered for worship, and their thoughts were focused on the goodness of God. They recounted how God had moved since the conversion of that first Indian sometime previous. Over those dozen years, there were now 11 churches of Indians, averaging over 30 members in each church. 20 Indian evangelists had been prepared for the work and were now active in preaching to their own people. They continued the list of things for which they were thankful. The following Sunday, just a few days after having this news broken to him, Carey preached at the morning worship service. His sermon was very simple. It had 2 points. Number 1, God's right to dispose of us as He pleases. And number 2, man's duty to acquiesce to His will. Again, the doctrine of divine sovereignty was the great comfort in the midst of great darkness. The events which followed, however, are nothing short of remarkable. Locally, the response was in itself overwhelming. Within a week, various government officials and even Carey's own students in Calcutta began collecting and sending money to the mission, moved by the devastation that it had incurred. The news of the fire also reached the British Missionary Society 6 months later, in September of that year, 1812. Up to that point, the English church at large, even within the Baptist denomination, had been largely apathetic to and unconvinced by the mission of Carey and his compatriots. The Baptist society itself was poor and very limited in its resources and influence. They came from very small churches. Beyond them and their meager churches, there had been very little interest in the mission at Serampore. But the news of the fire and its devastation was a distinct tug on the rope from the depths of the mine. Like beacon lights lighting on the tops of mountain peaks, news spread quickly from one church to another, crossing denominational boundaries and extending even into Scotland. Andrew Fuller would quickly write back to Carey these words: "When your late disastrous intelligence reached us, a strong sensation was felt throughout the kingdom, not only in our own denomination, but amongst Christians of every name, each vying with the rest to repair your losses." As the money and pledges rolled in, Fuller estimated and said to Carey that the English and Scottish churches should reasonably have all the necessary funds ready to cover the rebuilding costs in only 8 months. These churches, which had ignored Carey and even scoffed at this grandiose vision, were awakened by the fire. Gathering the thousands of British pounds needed over 8 months would itself have been remarkable if that had been the case. A dramatic change from the past apathies. But Fuller would have to correct his estimation. In just 2 months, 2 months after hearing the news of the fire, Fuller would walk into a society meeting and with wet eyes would report that all of the money needed had been raised. 1 year later, and this is miraculous, 1 year later,